Hello and welcome to this edition of Google Firestarters. I'm Neil Perkin, the curator of Google Firestarters and also the founder of consultancy business Only Dead Fish. So if you see our first time here, Firestarters is a series of conversations with the interesting and interested of the advertising, marketing and beyond community, focusing on areas of challenge and opportunity within the industry. But this series of conversations really builds off the back of almost 60 live events that we did over 10 years at Google. But these podcasts are always structured around the same 5 questions. So we ask, what's the best thing that you've learned in your career to date? What's the biggest mistake that you've made in your career? What you learned from that? Key insights around how the industry is changing, what your key prediction is for the industry, and then also about what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you, and what's your answer to that? So today's guest is both interesting and interested. I'm delighted to welcome Sara Tate. So Sara is an organisational consultant, exec coach, and also former CEO of TBWA London, and also the author of a brand new book called The Rebuilders, going from setback to comeback in business and beyond. And she's also the host of the Rebuilders podcast. I should say she's won quite a few awards as well. She's been voted the best leader in marketing at the Women in Marketing Awards. So welcome, Sara. And if I could just ask to begin with about your book, because that's brand new, it's coming out. And if I could just ask a bit about why you wrote a book about resilience. Why did you choose to do that?
So thanks for having me on. I'm just in my kitchen having a chat to you, but it's lovely to be here. So why did we write a book about rebuilding? My co-author and I, Anna, had gone into TBWA in 2017 as part of a team, a turnaround team, to try and bring that business back to its peak, really. It was a wonderful brand and it had some wonderful clients, but it had some tough times. And so we were really interested in that sort of organizational, commercial business rebuilding. And then that was all going super lovely and brilliant. And then March 2020 came, and suddenly we all know what happened. And everything around us felt so uncertain, and what was happening, etc. So we both were working. We had 2 very small children each, homeschooling, husbands are working, and we just became more and more interested in how do you approach stuff when things aren't on the up, just generally in life and work. And to save our sanity at the time, we started a podcast on that topic, really just, I think, probably to feel better by listening to other people's stories about things that had gone wrong. So we talked to people who'd been to prison, we talked to people who'd overcome alcoholism, all kinds of things. And then after one series, we realized that there were learnings starting to emerge. And what was even more fascinating was the learnings were the same for work and life. They were the same things. And these people would talk interchangeably about, how getting this thing they'd learned, getting divorced, helped them when their business was in trouble, and all the how things they learned in prison had helped them when they came out again. And so like 2 good strategists, we set about trying to learn more and ended up writing a book about it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sara. Some themes I'd love to come back to if that's all right, but let me get started with my first question, which is what's the best thing that you've learned in your career to date?
I love these questions, by the way. I had to have a really good think about them. The best thing that I've learned, I think, and it's so easy to say now, I'm, a sort of slightly grey-haired middle-aged woman, and hindsight's a wonderful thing. But I think the best thing I've learned over time is follow the roles and the aspects of your roles that you like the most. I'm not going to say that you love, because obviously if you love something in your job, that's brilliant. But just really like is good enough, I think, rather than the aspects that you think you should be like, or the moves that are sort of you feel most pressured to do. And I have learned that by making a number of very unfashionable career moves, which I gnashed my teeth over at the time, but in hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, were really good. So an example was, I was in strategy for a long time, and at the time I wasn't, the way strategy was going, I wasn't enjoying it. I was very frustrated, and I was really disliking work, and I was complaining a lot. It's my husband now, husband will tell you. And I decided to move into new business. And there was a sort of loud sucking of teeth whenever I told anyone who worked in strategy, because as anyone who's worked in new business will know, it's not considered to be the most intellectual of disciplines, etc., etc. Anyway, and a lot of people were like, why? And it was generally considered to be a bad move. But the truth was, I wasn't happy in what I was doing. And I think what would have happened is I'd have gone on to become a very disgruntled strategist who was probably a little bit rude to clients, and I probably wouldn't have progressed. And by going into new business, it actually reignited my love of the industry, and it also eventually led me into general management. It was the first time I got on the board, was in a new business role. I got to see how an agency worked. I then became an MD. Eventually, I became a CEO, and now people say, oh, it's wonderful because you were a strategist, but you've also have such good commercial experience because you've run a P&L. And I thought at the time, you all sucked your teeth at that move. But I think the lesson there for me was I didn't go on and push to do the thing which I was supposed to do, because I just followed the thing which for me, I just couldn't bear to do it anymore, but I just followed the thing which I was enjoying more. And in the end, you will be better in that area. If you push on the door, which is already a bit open and you like doing, you can go on to really excel. If you just keep banging your head against the job you should be doing, but not enjoying it, I think it becomes hard work.
Yeah, I think somebody said to me once actually about how, if you're thinking about changing your career, or you're thinking about what to do next, not to really think about the job title, not to think about I want to be a this, but to actually, to your point, think about the things you like doing.
Yes.
And do you think people would get a bit caught up in job titles and narrow kind of ideas about roles and so on?
I think one does. I do as well. And I also understand why, because you try and we all want to try and look ahead in our careers and make sure that we're planning wisely about where we're going to go. And one of the factors you think about is, package, and you think about learning, and you think about responsibilities and job. The title is a part of it. But I think it can be, I found it very useful to talk to people who outside of the industry for whom title doesn't, it's not that it doesn't mean as much, they just don't get it. So for example, when I took the new business role, shortly afterwards, two people who were my peers got made head of planning. And I felt I was really sort of like, oh, I should have stayed and I should have become the head of planning. And then I talked to my sister, and she said, what's the matter? And she's a GP in the NHS and doesn't really understand the titles. And I said, well, if I'd stayed on doing that job for another year, I could have been made head of planning. And she went, why would you want that? You hated that job. And I was like, oh yeah, I did. And I still would have hated it if I'd been called head of planning. I understand why the titles are used as a sort of internal guide for ourselves, but it can be useful to step outside of them and just sort of really assess what about the role you're enjoying or not.
And can I ask a bit about, it's interesting you say you were quite frustrated with the way that strategy and planning was going.
Yes.
What was it that was frustrating you about that?
It's very interesting because having told that story, I have now returned to being a planner many, many years later. And as a strategist, my deep love, and we'll talk about this when we come on to talk about what's changed and what hasn't changed, is just understanding people and what makes them tick. I've always been an absolute, nosy ninny, sort of always peeking into people's windows, much to my husband's annoyance, and I'm fascinated by people. But at the time, planning goes through different cycles. At the time, I was in a position and in a phase of the marketplace where planning was around creative development. So it wasn't really human understanding, it wasn't really commercial understanding, it was basically a creative refinement. And it was effectively helping creatives get to briefs, which is a very valiant and amazing thing to do in planning. But I personally, it was taking me further away from getting to look at these amazing humans and what made them tick, and more into a lot of kind of creative wind tunnel of qual and quant around creative development. And I now see that was just a narrow angle of planning. It was just a pocket that I happened to be in at the time. But there are so many different aspects of it, but it's the people bit that I love.
Right. And I guess this is quite a good opportunity to ask you about mistakes as well, because you've written a book about resilience. So what is the biggest mistake that you've made in your career, and what did you learn from that?
I mean, how long have we got? I could have just written a whole book about mistakes that I've made, although it wouldn't have been very interesting. I mean, I've made so many. I once made an ad, for example, that at the time seemed fine, but actually killed Duffy's career, which I feel forever bad about, and people tease me about all the time. If anyone's old enough to remember the singer Duffy. The biggest mistake I've made as I look back, and again, it's very easy to say with hindsight, is pretending to know things when I didn't. And I don't mean, making stuff up. And I don't mean, a lot of the time you do need to know stuff. That is part of your job, is having the answer to certain things, particularly as a strategist. You need to know the business, and you need to know the numbers, and you need to understand the metrics. And I don't mean that. I mean the areas of like potential new knowledge and development that if I look back, I was always a little bit worried to say, I don't really know the answer to that. This is a new field, and because because the world around us changes so quickly, I think the need to be able to say, I don't know that anyone knows. Let's go and figure this out is really, really important. And actually we write about it a lot in the book, which is about the idea of sort of curiosity will take you further than knowledge. I think I thought that eventually I would know everything, and I just would kind of busk it until I got to there. And of course, the older I've got, the more I realize that I know almost nothing. And it was really crystallized for me as a CEO when, at the more senior I got, the more different disciplines you oversee. You're overseeing people who do incredibly specialist, amazing things that really I can't even get my head around. People would often regularly, multiple times a day, bring me problems that I had no idea really what they were talking about. And of course, you learn through a lot of coaching, and I'm a massive coaching advocate, to ask questions, to say, I don't know, what do you think? And create some space to say, I don't know, to allow permission for the other person to say, I don't know, and create the space to be curious about what a new solution might be. And I think that is hard to do, but it is a superpower if any of us can try and think about that. And the more I have dug into this area of sort of knowledge and expertise versus curiosity. In fact, the Buddhists have a great phrase for it, because they have phrases for all the good stuff, obviously, which they call it beginner's mind. They sort of say in the expert's mind, the possibilities are few, and in the beginner's mind, they're many. And for those of us that work in fast-moving industries where creativity is important, where innovation is important, the ability to say, I don't know. Let's be curious about what the solution could be. Let's try and forget assumptions and what we've learned, and think afresh about the opportunity or a possibility or a solution, is not just hugely powerful, but really, really important in business.
I guess that's really quite hard for planners and strategists to do, isn't it? Because the expectation is that as the planner, as a strategist, you have the answers. And I suppose there's a parallel here with leadership in general, isn't there? About how you can move away from that top-down hierarchical view of leadership, where leaders know all the answers and the answers flow down from the top of the organization.
Yes.
Into this sort of idea of like you're nurturing the environment in which you can all learn together, and that curiosity point you say. So is that a leadership wide thing, do you think, now?
I don't know if it's leadership wide, but I think it is now commonly held to take a coaching approach to leadership is better than a sort of didactic approach. And I, trying to deploy coaching questions, asking why, asking how from people. I think for a number of reasons. Like, firstly, as a leader in general, they say, what got you here won't get you there. I mean, the world changes so quickly, and I found this when I went to TBWA. I was like, I've got a set of tools, guys. I've got a kit for this. And after 9 months, you're like, well, I used all those ideas, and now what? You know, and you really quite quickly realize that that's lovely, but the whole world's changed, and these are new problems, and so you need to be open to solving them anew, but also critically, because it unlocks the resourcefulness in the people around you. So there's nothing worse than being told the solution to something. Boring. Whereas if someone asks you, what do you think, what's, you know, what are the challenges for you right now, how might we or you begin to think of ways around those, you really ask people to think and use their own resourcefulness and sort of step into their power and accountability, and it's much more rewarding for people at every level of the organization. So I just think encouraging at all levels, you know, if the leader can model it and then team leaders do it with their team and all the way down, just encourage, it makes a much more stimulating environment for people to be in.
And I'd love to ask as well, just building on that, about you know, you run creative businesses, and I think there was a phrase actually in the blurb of the book, which I really liked, which was how to recognize the creative potential found in the rubble of disappointment, which is a great phrase, isn't it? So tell me a bit about that, the creative potential. What does that really mean?
Yeah, so one thing we'd say about the book is it's not about saying every cloud's got a silver lining. We don't pretend that everything's, you know, brilliant. And there's nothing worse than when you're in the middle of something going wrong to be also pressurizing yourself to take out some great learning opportunity. So we don't mean that, but we do observe that for change to happen, some sort of fracture, dismantling has to occur. You know, if you look at any kind of change theory, you'll see there needs to be a dissatisfaction with the status quo for things to change. And actually, when we talk to, you know, we talk to lots of therapists, and one of the people we talked to used to be a divorce barrister, and she became a divorce counselor. And what she was saying was, by the time people come to her, they have decided to get divorced. You know, their relationships are very unhappy, and the challenge isn't to make their relationship happy again, because that's past. The challenge is to help them step into a hugely massive unknown, because to do that, they have to do that to leave this thing that made them unhappy. And in doing that, other things will come into their life. And I don't mean in a woo-woo way. It's just that if you leave that thing behind that makes you not happy, that you're no longer doing it, and there is a space for something else. So it's also just really practical, which is that, you know, after something goes wrong, there is the space for something, you know, fresh to occur. But it also is about that creativity thing. So none of us like setbacks. I mean, none of us like insecurity. That's why people stay in relationships. You know, we don't like, we'd rather, our psyche would rather stay with a situation that's stable, if not brilliant, than step into the unknown. But there is a group of people who actually not only like it, but seek that kind of instability. And when you look at it, it's artists. So we talk about David Bowie, or Grayson Perry talks about it a lot, about, you would see David Bowie dismantle something that was very successful, you know, an identity or an album, a style of music, just bin it and move on to something else in order to create the space for something new. And Grayson Perry's got a great quote where he talks about, you know, he says, I think I'm addicted to periods of fear and uncertainty, because if I don't feel like that, then I'm not going to make anything new. And so I think the artist is the real crucible of it, where you see they deliberately almost push themselves to get out of their comfort zone, out of their depth, to feel this fear, because they know that's the only way something new will emerge. And so I always think, you know, if it's good enough for David Bowie, I mean, it's good enough for the rest of us. And we're not, you know, most normal humans like us, we don't seek it out. But there is, I do believe that from the ending of something or a setback of some kind, there is a space for something else to come out.
Fantastic. And I think actually there was a piece which I read where you were talking about disruption. And of course, TBWA's positioning was all around disruption, wasn't
Yeah,
it? But I think you termed sort of disruption as a strategic philosophy about looking at things sideways, and creativity often being a disruptive act. So,
yes,
I mean, I guess talking about change, it would be good also just to bring this
yeah,
back to the industry and just think about what's
yeah.
your insight about how the industry itself is changing.
Yes. Change. We're all surrounded by change, and we've seen post-pandemic. I mean, I think that talk about VUCA climate, sort of volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. That term was invented post-Cold War, or to describe the Cold War. And now, like, everything's VUCA all the time. And the challenge with change is that you need to enter a period of sort of not knowing, and that's in order to be able to come up with something new. And that's quite scary for most businesses, because they need to be making the things they're making and getting the sales they're getting. And I think the how we used disruption at TBWA was to really create a sort of liminal space, really, to create a moment in time, or a day, or a process, or a place, that where it was possible to allow some contained disruption to happen. And I think agencies or creative companies, or whatever we want to call them, creative partners, play a vital role in helping clients do that in a safe, contained way. So, we all laugh about workshop days and things, but there's a real reason why they work, which is you create a liminal space away from other things, where people can let go of assumptions and unlearn certain things to experiment in a way that isn't going to kind of burn the house down. And so creating that space, or that relationship, or that, in whatever form that takes, I think is a vital role that agencies and creative companies play. It's also very difficult to do on oneself. So, as in an agency business, you'll know it's quite hard to disrupt yourselves. And the same as it's quite hard for clients to disrupt themselves. So the idea of a third party coming in who has a slightly wonky view, a slightly sideways view, who can provocate, who can offer up different things in order to help a client do and see things differently, in order to innovate and change and keep up with the change that's happening around, is such a vital role that creative partners play.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think, I mean, sometimes I talk to my clients about the difference between optimization and transformation. So optimization being about
Yes.
doing what you did
Yeah.
before, but doing it faster, better, more
Yeah.
efficiently. But then transformation being that unlearn and relearning piece that you just mentioned
Yes.
there. And that's obviously pretty challenging because you're used to doing things in a certain way. So you talked about creating that sort of liminal space to do that. Are there any kind of tools or techniques or things that actually help people to unpack those assumptions and to unlearn and then put it back together again?
Yes. So I am a great believer in doing things in a sort of small experimental way, and doing it in an experiential way. So there's lots of research. I'm a trained Gestalt coach, and the Gestalt theory is around, there's no point just telling people you should be like this, or telling them things they should know or things they should do. People actually have to experience it for themselves. So they do lots of little experiments. And I think the same, you can go into a business and you can talk to them about the woods are burning and you need to digitally transform, but it doesn't actually help humans go through the change they need to go through. So creating small pilot schemes, creating pilot teams, creating small projects to explore how a particular change feels, and then testing and learning from there, is a much more effective way of kind of getting that change into people's fibers. And so it's a sort of reverse transformation project in a way. It's not like, here's the answer, here's the plan, let's all go and do this. It's sort of a little bit more bottom up. So, sometimes that's workshops, sometimes it's taking a small portion of a client's budget and saying, this is a test and learn team. But anything, I would always think, how can you make it experiential, and how can you make it experimental, in whatever form that is? Because that is the way to embed that change and help take people from A to B.
And I think I read as well that you said in one piece, that one interview I think I read, about in order to be a change maker, you have to do the work yourself. So is there something about actually getting in and experiencing it yourself as well?
I believe so. So I think you need to. I think there's two things. I think the better we are at going through experiencing our own transformations, be that just in our lives, going, you're single and then you're married, or you leave a job, etc. I think if we reflect on those experiences and how we went through them and how that felt, those learnings are so important when we come and ask the same of other people. There's a great phrase by William Bridges, who's a big writer about transformation, where he says, it's not the change that kills you, it's the transformation. The change is the thing that happened. Lyft came into the market for Uber, or that's not the thing. It's the transformation, getting from state A to state B. And I think reflecting on what it felt like and having an empathy for the people you're asking to go through a similar change is really important. But I think also going in and literally going through the change with them, i.e. not going in, I've got all the answers, people, this is how it's going to be, let me slightly patronizingly facilitate a workshop where you gradually come to realize what I know. Completely wrong. Because actually, first of all, back to the questioning point and not knowing, those people in the room are probably going to come up with something way better than me, because they're just a brilliant group of brains. But also you need to be prepared when you go into it that some slightly different things might emerge. That doesn't mean it's like total, chaos, we're never going to get anywhere, but you need to allow those people to, allow them to experiment and design and see what comes out. So you do need to kind of get in there with them. That's also why in the book we focus on work and life, because you might not have run a digital transformation before, but you may have gone through other forms of transformation in your personal life or in other businesses. You might have had to assemble a team or break a team apart, and so you can, if you think about it, reflect on how those things felt, and you'll have way more learnings than you think you do to transfer across.
Yeah, I love that. And so talking about change, I'd love to ask you about the future now and your prediction really for the future of the industry. Tell me a bit about that.
I've talked a lot about change and the fact that there's loads of it, but I think also, there's two aspects. I think one is that human beings don't really change very much. There's certain aspects of how we're wired, how we're motivated, what we're fearful of, how we write narratives for ourselves, all of that, which just comes from our neural laydown and sort of evolutionary psychology. So at its heart, human beings don't change that much. And I'm really enjoying coming back round to focusing on people again. And I do think if one is thinking everything is really overwhelming and so much is changing, just go back to the heart of trying to understand what makes people tick. And because that is also the incongruence between how consistent and how human beings are and how slowly we evolve, and the pace of change around us is also what's causing a lot of challenges. It's what causes projects to fail. It's what causes, when a big consultant goes in and does a big digital transformation, then leaves and it all falls apart. It's because the people, the flesh and blood people, are still not in that place yet. It's also, we see it where technology comes in at a pace and meets people who aren't changing their behaviors as quickly or changing the way that their brains respond to it as quickly, and we see issues come up. So the use of social media is a great example. The way that we build trust and we absorb information and we process information probably hasn't changed that much, and yet the way that information comes at us has changed radically. So understanding and making a difference seeing the difference as a strategist between what endures and what changes very quickly, and what the challenges are where those two things rub up against each other, I think is really important and will only become more so. So do focus on what endures and do try and understand the aspects of humans that don't change. The other my sort of prediction for the creative industries, I guess, is the need to think innovatively. Let's not use the creativity word for a bit, because people get quite hung up on what it means. The need to sort of experiment and think innovatively, and think 3 steps ahead, and solve problems that haven't even been existed yet, is just getting greater and greater and greater when we see it with the climate emergency. And so the need for open-minded creative thinking and problem solving is enormous. But I think that in our industry, probably because of the background I've come from within advertising and communications, I think it's too focused towards the creation of comms artifacts. And I would love to see, and they do exist, but I think we'll see a lot more of them, boutique groups of amazing brains, multidisciplinary, and I mean an inventor plus an engineer plus a creative plus a writer, etc., brought together to put those brains around problems that is not connected necessarily to the making of creative artifacts, will be, will grow and grow. I think it would be really, really fascinating to see. And I have great respect for the creative industries. My husband is a creative director. I just feel it's a slice, and we've got so many creative brains focused in that one area, when I see so many challenges that they could also be focused towards.
I love your point about focusing on what endures. It reminded me actually of, I think, a Bezos quote about how important it is, and I think he was talking about it in the context of new technology trends and so on.
Yeah.
And how important it is to focus on the fundamental things that don't change as much as it is on the things that do change.
Yeah.
Do you think in general that the industry gets a bit fixated on the kind of the new, the kind of the fads, the stuff that sort of is changing quickly?
I think we need to hold both things in our mind at the same time, and I think that's difficult. I remember David Weldon, who's the old CMO of Royal Bank of Scotland, said once, "Don't be the dog that barks at every passing car." And I think it's difficult because we need to understand the fundaments of climate, of science, of psychology, of biology, of people, because that's not changing. But we also, at the same time, need to be really interested and curious about all of the new stuff that's coming along. And so I think it's holding those two things in mind at the same time, or maybe having a company where some people are brilliant at one bit and some people are brilliant at the other bit. And so it can be, I'm not someone who goes, "Oh, the metaverse, boring." I'm like, yes, that, and global warming, which is based on some scientific principles that haven't changed, and maybe they could help each other. So I think we just need to keep a balance between the two.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we're almost out of time, unfortunately, but I'd love to ask you my final question, if that's okay, which is, what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you, and what's your answer to that?
I was thinking the question I wish you had asked me is, what am I optimistic about? Because it's a really tough time for everyone. And I think everyone feels quite mentally battered and bruised. But I am optimistic for lots of reasons. I think in part because I do believe that human beings are immensely resilient. And I do believe that there is a lot that endures in terms of the way that people support each other, the way that people do coalesce around problem solving. And I also see, I have 2 kids who are 6 and 7. And as much as I sometimes feel like we don't change quickly enough in society to approach new, to tackle issues, I just see them, and I just see they're so radically different in so many ways. And for example, I see a lot of younger people in work now who have a very different approach to the role of work in their lives. And I think that's a massive thing we're going to see. I think there'll be a much more balanced approach. I think I think people will require their work to also fulfill their family needs, their health needs, etc. And I do feel optimistic, in spite of the fact that when we peek out of the window, it seems like there's a lot of stuff to solve.
Fantastic. I love your optimism, and that's a great way to wrap up the this episode. Thank you, Sarah. So my thanks go to Sara Tate, and do look out for her book, The Rebuilders. And if you enjoyed this episode, do check out the other episodes of Google Firestarters, and do subscribe and like this video. So my thanks again to Sara Tate. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure, Neil. Thank you.